Duty. By humiliating an innocent woman. That's not what you're doing here, Grant. You're abusing your power, and I won't stand by and let it happen, Margaret declared, her voice steady but fierce. The crowd, which had been murmuring in unease, now seemed to hold its collective breath, caught between the tension in the air. Emily, still standing with her hands restrained, couldn't help but feel a surge of hope. She'd been isolated in this situation, feeling as though the weight of the world was on her shoulders. But now, this brave woman, this stranger, had spoken out. It was a reminder that not everyone was willing to tolerate such injustice. The officers, who had been trying to assert their authority with aggressive demeanor, now found themselves facing not just Emily, but this unexpected challenge. Grant's face tightened with frustration, but he didn't retreat. You don't know what you're talking about, he spat back at Margaret, his voice growing more defensive. She's breaking the law by obstructing our investigation. If you don't want to get involved, you'd better move along. Margaret stood her ground, refusing to back down even as Johnson moved closer, his posture threatening. I'm not going anywhere, she shot back, her voice unwavering. You have no evidence that she's done anything wrong, and you're treating her like a criminal for no reason. You don't get to decide who belongs here and who doesn't. The crowd remained tense, watching the scene unfold with a mix of shock and disbelief. Some had their phones out, recording the interaction, while others simply stood frozen, witnessing this moment of injustice. The silence that hung over the street was deafening, but Emily could feel the weight of Margaret's words filling the space around them. It was a reminder that sometimes the voice of one person could challenge the wrongs of many. With the situation escalating, Grant turned his attention back to Emily. His grip on authority slipped as his earlier arrogance began to waver. You're lucky I don't escalate this further, he muttered, clearly agitated by the growing tension. Emily, though still shaken by the unfairness of the whole encounter, maintained her composure. You are making a mistake. I haven't done anything wrong, and I won't be intimidated, she said, her voice steady, but with a firmness that was growing with every passing moment. At that moment, the sound of an approaching car broke the tension. Emily recognized the vehicle immediately. It was her husband's. Jacob Davis, the city's police commissioner, was known for his no-nonsense approach, but he was also fiercely protective of Emily. She hadn't expected him to be in the area, but his arrival was timely. The car came to a stop just as Grant and Johnson seemed to be at their breaking point. Jacob stepped out of the vehicle, his imposing figure immediately commanding attention. His sharp eyes took in the scene in an instant, the handcuffs, the officers, and the gathered crowd. What is going on here? He asked, his voice calm but filled with authority. Emily's heart gave a small leap of relief. She didn't have to say anything. Jacob would handle this. The two officers froze at the sound of his voice, their expressions shifting from aggressive to wary. We were just doing our job, Commissioner, Grant stammered, his earlier confidence faltering under Jacob's gaze. Jacob's gaze never left the officers, his jaw tight. It doesn't look like you're just doing your job, Grant. It looks like you're harassing my wife for no reason. His words were measured but carried the weight of someone who didn't need to raise his voice to command respect. The officers stood there, caught in the wrong, and for a brief moment, the city street was still. Margaret, who had stood steadfast against the office's treatment of Emily, now turned her eyes toward Jacob. She's right. These two have been abusing their power, and they have no cause to treat her like this. Jacob nodded at Margaret, acknowledging her support with a slight gesture before turning his attention back to the officers. Grant, Johnson, I want you to release her now. And I want you both to explain yourselves. This is not the kind of behavior that will be tolerated under my watch. Do you understand? Grant opened his mouth to protest, but Jacob's glare silenced him. After a long pause, he reluctantly motioned for Johnson to remove the handcuffs. As the cold metal was unlocked and released from Emily's wrists, she exhaled a breath she hadn't realized she was holding. The sting of the cuffs remained, but the moment felt like a small victory. Emily turned to Jacob, her eyes filled with both gratitude and lingering frustration. Thank you, she whispered, her voice thick with emotion. Jacob simply nodded, his expression softening as he reached for her hand. Margaret, still standing tall, gave Emily a reassuring smile. You didn't deserve any of this. You're not alone, dear. Emily returned her smile, grateful for the support from this unexpected ally. The officers, now thoroughly chastised, were left standing in the street, their posture slumped. The injustice they had tried to impose was now exposed, and the power dynamics had shifted in a matter of moments. As the crowd began to disperse, some offering nods of approval to Margaret and Emily, others murmuring their own thoughts on the situation, Emily took a deep breath. It wasn't just about this one moment. It was about the reminder that power should never be abused, and that those who stand for what is right, even in the face of overwhelming odds, can make a difference. In the distance, the wind still whispered through the streets of Greenville, but for Emily, it no longer felt as cold. "Duty, you're abusing your power," she said, her voice sharp. At this point the crowd started whispering more. A few people pulled out their phones trying to record the entire situation while no one dared to step up like Margaret. It was clear that the scene was attracting more attention and the tension in the air was rising. Although grateful for Margaret's bravery, Emily couldn't help but worry that the situation might spiral out of control. "Thank you for standing up for me," she said, her voice gentle but meaningful, "but I don't want you to get involved. My husband is on his way and he will handle this." Margaret looked at Emily, concern written on her face, but she also knew that Jacob Davis, the police commissioner, might be the only one who could hold these officers accountable. She stepped back a few paces, but her gaze never left Grant and Johnson, as if signaling that she wouldn't leave until everything was resolved. Grant, noticing Margaret's unwavering stare and the growing crowd around them, began to feel more uncomfortable. He turned to Johnson and muttered, his voice tense, "We don't need more trouble. Let's keep things under control until this guy shows up." Johnson nodded, but his expression revealed his unease. Neither of them had expected their actions to draw so much attention, and neither knew the real storm was about to hit with Jacob Davis's arrival. Meanwhile, Emily stood tall, her eyes fixed on the road ahead where she knew Jacob would appear any moment. Though her hands were cuffed, a flicker of hope sparked within her. Margaret's support and the looks from the crowd around her made Emily realize that no matter what these two officers did, justice would ultimately be on her side. Emily stood there, hands cuffed, feeling a deep sense of humiliation. The scrutinizing looks from passers-by and the whispers surrounding her were like blades cutting into her self-esteem. Despite her efforts to remain composed, Emily knew she couldn't handle the situation on her own. Her eyes lit up with determination as she made the one call she could make at this moment to Jacob, the one person she knew would never let her face this injustice alone. With her hands restricted by the cold cuffs, Emily fumbled for her phone in her jacket pocket. Grant watched her, a mocking look in his eyes, but he didn't stop her. He seemed to think that this call wouldn't have any effect on the situation. Emily dialed Jacob's number quickly, the phone pressed against her ear, and she took a deep breath, trying to steady her voice despite the turmoil inside her. Two rings sounded before Jacob's deep, authoritative voice came through on the other end. "Emily, what's going on?" She gripped the phone tightly, her voice trembling with a mix of anger and hurt. "Jacob, I've been stopped by two officers, Grant and Johnson. They said I fit a description of some sort and were searching for me in the middle of the street. They've even cuffed me." "What are they doing?" Jacob's voice suddenly dropped, but there was an unmistakable fury in it. "I don't know," Emily said, struggling to keep her tone calm but unable to hide her frustration. "I just left the cafe. I haven't done anything wrong. They have no warrant, no clear reason, but they're treating me like a criminal." Where are you?" Jacob asked, his voice clear and resolute. "I'm at the corner of Olive and Maple, right in front of the cafe," she said quickly. "I don't know what to do, Jacob. They won't listen to anything I say. I'm on my way," Jacob replied, his voice firm, each word of promise she couldn't doubt. "Stay right there, Emily. Wait for me." The call ended and Emily lowered her hand, her eyes simmering with hope. She knew Jacob wouldn't just show up for her, but that he would do everything in his power to ensure that justice was served. As Emily waited, the situation continued to deteriorate. Grant moved toward her purse, ripping it open and beginning to rummage through its contents roughly. His fingers yanked out each personal item, throwing them haphazardly onto the ground. "I don't think you have the right to do this," Emily said, her voice calm but her eyes challenging. "You don't have a search warrant and I don't consent to this." Grant shrugged, offering no reply. He continued to sift through her purse, each motion deliberately slowed as if to humiliate her. Lipstick, makeup, a small notebook, all tossed to the ground, rolling among the onlookers' stares. Meanwhile, Johnson began rifling through her jacket and clothing. His hands touched her sleeve and the pockets of Emily's coat disrespectfully, making her feel deeply offended. "What are you hiding here?" Grant mocked, his voice dripping with sarcasm. Emily stood tall, her eyes hardening. "Nothing, and you know that," she said, each word clear and firm. Grant looked up, a self-satisfied smirk on his face. "You talk like you know the law, but I'm afraid today you're going to be answering a lot of questions." Emily stared at him, unwavering. "I know enough to see you're overstepping your authority, and I know my husband won't let this slide." Grant laughed derisively, the sound echoing echoing through the tense air. Your husband, who is he? A lawyer, someone who can save you? Go ahead and call him. I'd love to meet him. Emily didn't respond. She only turned her gaze back to the road where she knew Jacob would appear any moment. More people began to gather around, a few silently filmed with their phones capturing the entire event. Others whispered among themselves, showing their discontent with how the two officers were acting, but no one dared to step forward. What's going on here? A woman whispered to her friend nearby. She hasn't done anything wrong. I saw her just leave the cafe, the friend replied. But those two are abusing their power. Emily overheard the whispers, but they brought her no comfort. Instead, she felt the isolation of her situation more acutely. Grant and Johnson continued their search, ignoring the angry stares and silent protests from the crowd. Both of them believed they were in control, but they didn't know that this was about to change. From a distance, the sound of an engine broke the heavy silence. A black SUV sped toward the scene, and Emily's eyes lit up. The vehicle was not only bringing Jacob, the one person she trusted most, but also the justice she had been waiting for. Grant looked toward the approaching car, his face briefly showing uncertainty, but he quickly regained his confidence. Johnson said nothing, but his eyes were fixed on the SUV, as if sensing the storm was about to hit. Emily took a deep breath and steadied herself. She knew Jacob wasn't just coming to protect her, he was coming to confront the injustice these two officers had caused. Inside her, the anger and hurt slowly shifted to a small flicker of hope that this nightmare was about to end. The roar of an engine echoed from afar, cutting through the tense atmosphere like the prelude to an approaching storm. The familiar black SUV sped toward the scene, its wheels screeching against the road as it came to a sudden stop near the curb, causing the crowd to murmur and step back. The car door swung open and Jacob Davis stepped out. Jacob Davis, the police commissioner of Greenville, was a tall man with an air of authority and power. His police uniform, adorned with a gleaming badge, black polished boots, and a stern demeanor, made others instinctively wary. His brow furrowed and his sharp eyes scanned the scene in front of him, pausing when they landed on his wife Emily, who stood in the middle of the street, her hands handcuffed and her personal belongings scattered on the ground. His face immediately darkened, a fiery rage igniting in his eyes. The already heavy atmosphere became suffocatingly silent. The crowd surrounding them instantly realized that the man who had just arrived was no ordinary individual. Grant and Johnson, who had initially worn smug expressions, now turned pale as they realized the man they were confronting was their highest superior. Grant stiffened, his throat dry. Johnson instinctively took a step back, cold sweat beading along his temples. Without a word, Jacob walked straight. Jacob walked over to Emily, his expression both fierce and tender, a juxtaposition of emotions that reflected the gravity of the moment. He gently bent down, unlocking the handcuffs with steady hands. The metallic clink echoed through the tense atmosphere, each sound carrying the weight of humiliation Emily had just endured. The cuffs dropped to the pavement with a definitive thud, marking the end of the immediate injustice inflicted upon her. "Are you all right?" Jacob asked softly, his voice low and warm, a private moment of concern amidst the public spectacle. His gaze softened, a stark contrast to the commanding authority he'd exuded just moments ago. It was a rare glimpse into his vulnerability, reserved only for those he cared deeply about. Emily nodded, though the pain in her eyes lingered. "I'm fine," she replied quietly, though her voice betrayed a faint tremor. She was far from fine, but she didn't want to show weakness, especially now. Jacob rose to his full height, turning his attention to the two officers who stood before him. His gaze was as sharp as a blade, cutting through the facade of authority Grant and Johnson had clung to. The growing crowd around them watched in hushed anticipation, the tension so thick it seemed to stifle the air. "Explain yourselves," Jacob commanded, his voice steady and authoritative. "Why did you stop my wife in the middle of the street and treat her like a criminal? I want a clear and specific answer." Grant shifted uncomfortably, his confidence visibly shaken. He licked his lips, searching for words that eluded him. "Sir, we received a report about suspicious activity in the area." She matched the description. Jacob's eyebrow arched, disbelief etched across his face. "Matched the description?" His voice dripped with sarcasm. "What description, exactly? Can you describe it for me in detail?" Grant opened his mouth but faltered, the words refusing to come. His partner, Johnson, cast his gaze downward, avoiding eye contact altogether. They both knew they had no substantial answer to give. Jacob took a step closer, his presence towering over them, causing both men to instinctively take a step back. "What did you think made her suspicious? Was it simply because she's a woman of color standing outside a coffee shop?" His voice grew sharper with each word, slicing through the office's thin veneer of authority. The crowd murmured, their whispers growing louder. The tension in the air was palpable. People began recording on their phones, ensuring the unfolding scene would not be forgotten. Grant swallowed hard. We were just following procedure, he muttered weakly. Procedure. Jacob's eyes narrowed. What part of your procedure includes handcuffing an innocent woman without probable cause, throwing her belongings on the ground, and searching her as if she were a criminal? Tell me, officer, which manual teaches you that level of disrespect? Johnson fumbled for words, his voice shaky. We didn't mean to offend her. We were just doing our job. Jacob's voice grew colder. Is it your job to strip people of their dignity? Is it your job to humiliate someone because you can? He took another step closer. This isn't law enforcement. This is an abuse of power. And it ends now. The murmurs in the crowd grew louder, people nodding in agreement. He's right. Someone called out. This can't go on. Grant and Johnson stood frozen, their confidence eroded by Jacob's relentless interrogation. Cold sweat beaded on their foreheads. They realized they were no longer in control of the narrative. Just then, the distant sound of engines echoed down the street. Two black SUVs from Internal Affairs pulled up, their tires screeching as they came to a halt. The officers inside stepped out, their expressions serious, their presence reinforcing the gravity of the situation. Jacob didn't break his gaze from Grant and Johnson. You've not only broken the trust of the people you're sworn to protect, but you've tarnished the uniform you wear. You will be held accountable. He turned to the Internal Affairs officers. These two have committed a serious abuse of power. I demand their immediate suspension and a full investigation into their conduct. Grant and Johnson lowered their heads, their faces pale. They knew their careers were on the line. The smugness they'd worn earlier was replaced by a haunting realization that they had pushed too far. The Internal Affairs officers approached, escorting Grant and Johnson away for questioning. The crowd watched, some filming, others whispering among themselves. The murmurs of discontent had shifted to murmurs of approval. Justice was beginning to be served. Jacob turned to Emily, placing a comforting hand on her shoulder. His expression softened once more. Are you sure you're all right? Emily looked into his eyes, finding solace in his presence. I am now, she whispered. Yet, despite the resolution, a lingering sorrow filled her chest. The pain of the experience wouldn't be so easily erased. Thank you, she added softly. I know this won't be easy. Jacob's eyes hardened with determination. It won't. But I made a promise to protect you, not just you, but everyone who might face this kind of injustice. This isn't over. We have to make sure it never happens again. Hours later, at the Greenville Police Department headquarters, an emergency meeting was called. News of the incident had spread rapidly, igniting a quiet but growing tension within the department. Jacob walked into the conference room with an air of authority. Senior officers were already gathered, some offering supportive glances, others glaring with skepticism. Captain Martin, a seasoned officer known for his traditionalist views, stood to address the room. Jacob, Martin began, his tone both challenging and cautious. Are you certain you handled this situation appropriately? Those two officers were following a report. They were just doing their duty. Jacob's expression remained unyielding. Doing their duty. By humiliating an innocent woman. By handcuffing her without cause. His voice was calm, but there was no mistaking the fury simmering beneath the surface. Martin shifted uncomfortably. They didn't know she was your wife. Jacob's eyes blazed. That's the point. If she weren't my wife, would they have acted any differently? Does justice change based on who you know? No. Respect and dignity should be given to every citizen, regardless of their connections or status. The room fell into a heavy silence. Jacob's words hung in the air, undeniable and irrefutable. This isn't just about my wife, Jacob continued. This is about a culture of unchecked power and prejudice within our department. It's about ensuring that no one, no matter their race, gender, or social standing, is subjected to this kind of treatment. Captain Martin opened his mouth to speak, but Jacob cut him off. We need to be better. We need to hold ourselves accountable. The trust of the community depends on it. Without trust, we have nothing. The room remained silent. Slowly, officers began to nod in agreement. Change was never easy, but it was necessary. And it was starting here, today. I understand what you're saying, Jacob, but you're setting a dangerous precedent. Captain Martin's voice echoed through the conference room, his tone carrying both concern and frustration. Internal affairs is already involved, and people outside are talking about this. Do you realize what this will do to the department's reputation? Jacob frowned, his expression darkening, the weight of his conviction pressing heavily on his shoulders. His tone turned colder, more resolute. Reputation. If we can't clean up the wrongdoings within our ranks, then we have nothing left to protect. I'd rather lose our reputation than let people like Grant and Johnson continue to run rampant. If we don't handle this seriously, who will trust the Greenville police anymore? Several officers around the table nodded in agreement, their faces reflecting the shared concern of a system that had long been flawed. But others remained silent, their expressions tense, unwilling to openly align themselves with Jacob's uncompromising stance. The internal conflict within the department was becoming clearer by the minute, dividing the force into two factions: those who supported Jacob's push for accountability and those who believed he was tarnishing the organization's image. After the meeting, Jacob walked out of the room, his face icy and set with determination. He knew the road ahead would be long and arduous. What he was doing was right, but standing up against entrenched corruption and deep-rooted biases in a system riddled with intricate relationships and conservatism would never be easy. Emily was waiting for him outside, leaning against a marble pillar in the hallway. Her face softened when she saw him, but the worry in her eyes was unmistakable. "Is everything okay?" she asked gently, her voice a quiet solace amidst the storm raging around them. Jacob paused for a moment, taking in the sight of her, the woman he loved, who had suffered so much already. He reached out, taking her hand in his. "Not yet, love, but I can't back down. This isn't just about you. It's about everyone else out there. I won't let this injustice continue." Emily nodded slightly, squeezing his hand in silent support. She understood the path Jacob was walking. It wouldn't be easy, but she knew he would never stop. His sense of duty, not just to her but to every person in Greenville, would keep him moving forward. In the distance, the Greenville Police Headquarters stood tall, a looming symbol of power and responsibility. But inside its walls, a quiet battle was taking place, a battle between reform and conservatism, between justice and cover-up. Jacob knew that if he wanted to bring about real change, he would have to face even greater challenges ahead. And he was ready for that. After the tense meeting at headquarters, Jacob didn't allow himself any time to rest. He pushed internal affairs to expedite the investigation into Grant and Johnson's actions, urging them to leave no stone unturned. The investigation expanded rapidly, and within days, what was uncovered shocked everyone. It turned out that this was not the first time Grant and Johnson had abused their power. A series of complaints from years past were reopened. The records painted a grim picture. Both officers had frequently targeted minorities, people who were vulnerable, unable to resist, or had no one to back them up. Some cases had been left unresolved, dismissed with reasons like lack of evidence, or misunderstanding during the execution of duty. As the investigation progressed, several victims of Grant and Johnson's misconduct came forward. Their stories gradually emerged, piecing together a chilling narrative of systemic abuse of power. A young black man recalled how he had been stopped by the two officers while walking home late at night after his shift. A Latina woman shared her experience of being suspected of theft while simply browsing in a store. Each story was different, but all had one thing in common: the humiliation, helplessness, and sense of being treated as lesser simply because of their background. Emily was invited to testify as a witness in the investigation. Despite still feeling weary from the ordeal, she agreed to participate. She knew her voice wasn't just for herself but also for all those who had suffered similar injustices without ever having a chance to be heard. On the day of her testimony, Emily walked into a large meeting room at Internal Affairs with quiet resolve. The atmosphere was solemn. She sat across from the investigators, files and reports regarding the case spread out on the table before them. A small tape recorder was already switched on, capturing every word spoken. Miss Davis, an elderly investigator with white hair, addressed her, his tone respectful yet serious. "We understand this has been a difficult experience for you. But can you share with us, in your own words, what happened that day?" Emily took a deep breath, steadying herself. Her gaze remained fixed ahead, unwavering. She recalled every detail of that fateful day, from the moment Grant and Johnson stopped her on the street, to the mocking words they used, the scrutinizing stares, and the cold handcuffs tightening around her wrists for all to see. I had just stepped out of the cafe, a place I go to every week, she began, her voice calm but filled with emotion. I wasn't doing anything wrong. There was nothing unusual about it. But they stopped me and demanded to search me without any reason. I tried to ask why, but instead of answering, they used force, handcuffed me, and searched my bag as if I were a criminal. Her voice trembled slightly, but she kept going. What hurt me the most, Emily continued, was the look in the eyes of the people around me. They looked at me as if I had done something wrong. At that moment, I wasn't the wife of the police commissioner. I was just a woman standing there, with no one to protect me, no one to believe me. That was the most isolating and helpless feeling I've ever experienced. The room fell into a heavy silence, each word Emily spoke weighing on everyone present. Finally, one of the investigators spoke up. Do you think this incident had something to do with racial bias, Miss Davis? Emily's gaze hardened with determination. I don't think, she said firmly. I know. If I weren't a woman of color, I probably would have been treated differently. That's the truth we need to face, no matter how hard it is to hear. Her answer was met with solemn nods from the investigators. They carefully noted down every word she spoke. The truth was coming to light, and no one in the room could deny the severity of the issue anymore. Meanwhile, the expanded investigation by Internal Affairs continued to stir a wave of debate in the public. Local media picked up the story, reporting on the incident with headlines such as, "Police officers abuse power. Where is the justice?" and, "Discrimination in the force. Voices from the victims." The articles not only focused on Emily's ordeal but also highlighted the stories of other victims who had been mistreated by Grant and Johnson. The public outcry grew louder, putting immense pressure on the Greenville Police Department. People demanded accountability, transparency, and reform. The video footage of Grant and Johnson handcuffing Emily in the middle of the street went viral on social media, garnering millions of views and sparking thousands of comments. The injustice was laid bare for all to see. At home, Jacob and Emily sat together on the couch, watching the evening news. The television screen displayed a current affairs program discussing the ongoing investigation. Images of Emily, handcuffed with a pained expression, flashed across the screen, becoming a powerful symbol of the injustice that had taken place. Emily rested her head on Jacob's shoulder, seeking comfort in his presence. Do you think they'll change? She asked softly, her voice tinged with hope and uncertainty. Jacob placed his hand gently on hers, his gaze thoughtful but resolute. We can't change the whole world in one day, he said. But step by step, I believe things will get better. Major questions about transparency and ethics within our police force echoed throughout Greenville, amplified by the media's relentless coverage. The reporter's voice on the screen carried a somber note, resonating with viewers across the nation. How many other victims have suffered in silence without anyone listening? The reporter questioned. The weight of those words hung in the air as Emily watched, her eyes reflecting a mix of exhaustion and determination. The past few weeks had taken a toll on her, but she had no intention of backing down. Jacob sat beside her, his expression calm but resolute. As the screen displayed more images of protests and public debates, Emily glanced at him. I didn't expect this to go so far, she whispered, her voice laced with both surprise and concern. Jacob took her hand firmly, his grip a silent reassurance. I know this isn't easy, he said, his voice steady. But justice needs to be seen. If this is the way to change a system full of corruption, then we have to be even stronger. Despite the widespread support they had garnered, not everyone was on their side. Opposing views emerged online, with some accusing Emily of exploiting her husband's position to draw attention to her case. Social media became a battleground of opinions. She's the wife of the police commissioner. Of course, they're making a fuss about it, one user commented. But what about the many others who have no voice? Another post read, if she wasn't married to such a high-ranking official, would this case have been investigated as thoroughly? These criticisms, though baseless, felt like daggers to Emily's heart. She tried to ignore them, but the occasional sharp message or email would inevitably reach her, making her question if her efforts were in vain. Jacob, accustomed to public scrutiny, found it painful to see his wife endure such unwarranted attacks. No one has the right to blame you for standing up for yourself, he told her one evening, his gaze unwavering. You're doing this for everyone who's been wronged. Emily's resolve grew stronger. When a major television network invited her for an interview, she accepted after careful consideration. Sitting in the brightly lit studio, she faced the camera with poise. The host, a well-known reporter famous for asking tough questions, didn't hold back. Miss Davis, many people believe you're receiving special treatment because of your relationship with the police commissioner. How do you respond to these criticisms? Emily met the reporter's gaze without flinching. I'm not here seeking attention or special privileges. I'm standing up not just for myself, but for all those who have faced similar injustices and never had a chance to be heard. If I remain silent, this will continue to happen. And this is not just about me, it's about bringing change to a system that is supposed to protect everyone. Her words, calm yet powerful, resonated with viewers. The interview quickly went viral, with people from all walks of life praising her courage. Emily was hailed as a voice of justice and a beacon of hope. Meanwhile, Jacob faced mounting pressure both inside and outside the police department. Some officers accused him of betraying his colleagues by pushing for the investigation. In a tense meeting with department heads, one senior officer voiced his frustration. Commissioner, with all due respect, you're tarnishing our reputation. Officers are afraid to do their jobs. They feel like they're constantly under scrutiny. Jacob stood firm. I'm not betraying anyone. I'm protecting the principles we swore to uphold when we put on this uniform. If someone can't fulfill their responsibilities ethically, they don't deserve to be in our ranks. His words left the room in silence. The message was clear. There would be no compromise when it came to justice and accountability. As the investigation continued, more victims came forward with stories of mistreatment at the hands of Grant and Johnson. Their testimonies painted a grim picture of systemic abuse that had been allowed to persist for years. The media's focus shifted from Emily's case to the broader issue of corruption within law enforcement. Pressure mounted on Jacob to take decisive action. At a highly anticipated press conference held at the Greenville Police Headquarters, he addressed the public. Standing at the podium with the department's emblem behind him, he spoke with unwavering conviction. What has happened recently has exposed a painful reality in our system, he began. As police officers, we must protect citizens, uphold justice, and maintain trust. However, some have forgotten their sacred oath. They have abused their power, and that will not be forgiven. The room fell silent except for the clicking of cameras. Jacob continued, as police commissioner of Greenville, I'm announcing a series of sweeping reforms within the department. First, all officers will undergo mandatory retraining programs focused on communication, professional ethics, and eliminating bias in law enforcement. A few murmurs rose from the back of the room, but Jacob pressed on. Secondly, we will establish an independent oversight committee comprised of community members, legal experts, and human rights advocates. This committee will investigate complaints of misconduct transparently and objectively. He looked directly at the reporters. And finally, let me make this clear. There will be zero tolerance for abuses of power. Any officer found guilty of misconduct will be held accountable under the law and will be removed from our ranks. Jacob's bold reforms were met with both praise and resistance. Human rights organizations applauded his efforts, calling them a necessary step toward restoring public trust. Citizens rallied in support of the changes, viewing them as long overdue. However, within the department, some officers expressed their dissatisfaction. In the break room, discontent bubbled. Why should we suffer because of the mistakes of a few? An officer complained. Now everyone looks at us like criminals. I don't want some oversight committee scrutinizing me every time I make an arrest, another added. This is going to paralyze us. No one will dare to act anymore. Jacob was well aware of these sentiments. In a private meeting with senior leaders, he addressed their concerns head on. These reforms are not about punishing those who do their jobs right. They're about regaining the public's trust. If we don't change, we risk losing everything we stand for. Deputy Commissioner Sarah Mitchell, who had always supported Jacob, nodded in agreement. This is necessary. If we don't change, the system will collapse under the weight of its own mistakes. Outside the department, Emily continued to be a powerful advocate for change. She attended community meetings, shared her story, and encouraged others to speak out. Her voice became a symbol of hope and resilience, inspiring many to demand accountability and reform. Reform isn't about tearing everything down, Emily told a packed room at a local event. It's about building something better, something fairer. In a society that values respect for every individual, regardless of who they are, Jacob Davis continued to press forward. He recognized that the road to reform would not be simple, but the alternative, doing nothing, would leave future generations stuck in a broken system. With Emily's unwavering support, as well as allies within the community and the police department, he believed their efforts could bring real, lasting change. Jacob knew that the fight for justice was not easy, but if they didn't act now, the cycle of discrimination and abuse would never end. Jacob's relentless pursuit of reform sparked a revolution not only within the Greenville Police Department but also within the hearts of the citizens. They dared to hope for a future where justice and transparency weren't just lofty ideals but everyday realities. It was a vision where incidents like Emily's would never again unfold, where the public could trust the very people sworn to protect them. Weeks of investigation, uncovering damning evidence, and assembling witness testimonies culminated in the trial that would shake the city to its core. The case of officers Grant and Johnson was brought before the court, and it became more than just a legal matter. It became a symbol for the fight against the abuse of power in law enforcement. As the trial began, the atmosphere was electric with tension. The courtroom filled to capacity with reporters, activists, and local citizens eager to see justice served. Outside the courthouse, crowds of people held signs proclaiming, "Justice for all," and "No one is above the law." They were no longer just observers of a legal proceeding, they were part of something larger. Inside, Emily and Jacob sat at the front, steadfast in their belief that the truth would come to light. Across from them, Grant and Johnson sat on the defendant's bench, their once arrogant demeanor replaced by somber expressions of defeat. Gone were the confident smiles. The two officers now appeared as though they had lost everything: their careers, their pride, and the trust of the community they once swore to protect. The prosecutor, Karen Lewis, was a formidable presence in the courtroom. Known for her sharp intellect and dedication to human rights, she wasted no time in setting the tone for the case. "Ladies and gentlemen of the court," she began, her voice strong and unwavering, "today's case is not just about two officers abusing their power. It is about a system that has allowed such abuse to fester unchecked, a system that has discriminated against and harmed vulnerable communities for too long. The case of Emily Davis is just one example of the countless individuals who have been silenced by those entrusted with the power to protect them." She turned toward the two officers, Grant and Johnson, who seemed to shrink under her gaze. These officers detained Emily Davis in the middle of a busy street, searched her without cause, and handcuffed her, simply based on a suspicion with no valid reason or evidence. What they did is not law enforcement. It is an act of cruelty, a violation of basic human rights. The video evidence played on the screen for all to see, capturing the moment of Emily's humiliation, her face a mix of fear and confusion as she was treated like a criminal. The courtroom fell silent. No one could deny the injustice captured in those images. When the defense attorney for the officers stood, his words were hesitant, his defense weak. "Your Honor," he began, "my clients were simply doing their job. They received a report of suspicious activity, and they followed protocol." He paused, glancing nervously at the officers. They did not know who Ms. Davis was, nor did they intend to cause harm. Grant, the more vocal of the two officers, attempted to defend himself, saying, "We were just doing what we were trained to do. We didn't mean to humiliate anyone." But Karen Lewis was ready. "If that's the case, then why have there been numerous complaints against you both for targeting minorities, with no evidence to justify it?" She countered. "How many times have you violated the rights of innocent citizens, claiming to follow procedure, when in fact you were abusing your power?" Grant fell silent, unable to answer. Johnson, the quieter of the two, lowered his head, avoiding eye contact with anyone in the room. Their defense crumbled under the weight of the truth. When it was Emily's turn to take the stand, the entire courtroom held its breath. Her voice was calm but resolute as she spoke. "I am not here for revenge. I'm not here to make anyone look bad. I am here because I do not want anyone else to go through what I went through. I was humiliated, treated like a criminal, simply because of someone's suspicion." She paused for a moment, collecting herself before continuing. But the most painful thing wasn't just the way I was treated. It was looking around and seeing everyone standing there, afraid to speak up. That's why we need change. If we don't face this truth today, tomorrow there will be more victims. The room was silent for a long moment. Some in the courtroom wiped away tears, deeply moved by Emily's courage. Her words echoed in the hearts of all who heard them, a call for justice that could not be ignored. Days of testimony passed before the judge delivered the verdict, and when it came, it was decisive. Considering the severe abuse of power committed by officers Grant and Johnson, the judge stated, and their violation of the human rights of Emily Davis and many others, the court has decided to permanently revoke their law enforcement powers. They will also face administrative penalties and must perform community service for the next 2 years. The courtroom erupted in a wave of relief, with applause ringing out. The verdict was more than a punishment for 2 officers, it was a resounding declaration that no one, not even those in positions of power, was above the law. It was a victory for justice, and for the countless victims who had never been heard. As Emily and Jacob left the courthouse, surrounded by the crowd and reporters, a journalist asked Emily how she felt about the verdict. She smiled, her eyes filled with hope. This is not just my victory. This is a victory for justice and for everyone who has ever suffered in silence. I hope this marks the beginning of change. Jacob stood beside her, nodding. Justice is not the end. It is the beginning of a fairer, more transparent society. We will continue to fight to ensure that this never happens again. The crowd cheered as they walked out, waving flags and holding banners. The fight against abuse of power and discrimination was far from over, but Greenville had taken its first significant step forward. In the weeks that followed, the city seemed to fall into a temporary silence, as people reflected on the significance of the trial and its outcome. Emily's story was no longer just about one woman, it had become a symbol for a larger movement, a symbol of the fight against corruption and inequality. The courthouse no longer buzzed with activity, but for Emily and Jacob, the work had only just begun. Emily, once a quiet woman who avoided confrontation, had found her voice. She began speaking at schools, churches, and community centers, sharing her story and encouraging others to stand up when faced with injustice. Silence is never the solution, she told the crowds. We must unite and speak out for ourselves and for those who cannot. Under her leadership, the organization, Greenville Voice for Justice, was born. Its mission was clear: to provide legal support for victims of abuse and discrimination, and to raise awareness about civil rights. Emily had become a symbol of hope, not only for the victims of injustice but also for those who long for change. Jacob, too, continued his reform efforts with unwavering determination. He implemented measures that focused on retraining officers, improving their skills in handling situations without bias, and building stronger relationships with the community. His reforms weren't just theoretical, they were actively enforced, with strict oversight to ensure progress. The police wear this uniform to protect, not to oppress, Jacob said in a press conference. Only when we regain the trust of the community can we truly serve them. Gradually, the changes began to take root. Trust in the police began to grow, and the incidents of abuse decreased. People in the community no longer saw law enforcement as an adversary but as partners in maintaining peace and safety. One late afternoon, as the sun set behind the trees, Emily and Jacob sat on the porch, a quiet peace settling over them. Emily looked up at him, a hint of concern still lingering in her voice. Do you think things will change? Jacob smiled and squeezed her hand. Change doesn't happen in a day, but we've taken the first step. What you've done, what we've fought for, will leave a mark. It's the seed for a fairer future. Emily rested her head on his shoulder, her eyes gazing far into the horizon. I just hope that one day, no one will ever have to go through what I went through. A day when no one is judged because of their skin, their gender, or their background. Jacob nodded, his voice full of conviction. That day will come, Emily. As long as there are people like you, willing to stand up and fight, that day will come. The story of Emily and Jacob didn't end with the delivery of justice. It marked the beginning of a new chapter for Greenville, a chapter where respect, fairness, and dignity were the foundation of society. Their journey was a reminder that justice is not just about punishing wrongdoers but about creating a world where everyone is treated equally. Greenville had changed. The community was stronger, more united, and more aware than ever before of the power they had to make a difference. And as for Emily and Jacob, their journey continued, a journey toward a future where justice and equality were not just aspirations but realities. Their story was a testament to the power of perseverance and courage, proving that no matter the odds, change is always possible. This is the legacy they left behind.